Hey guys, and welcome back to Hoosier Hardware. Today we're talking about this guy right here. This is a roughly $200 gaming PC that I sort of cobbled together recently on eBay deals, and we're going to take a look at it today and see just what type of gameplay you can get out of a PC that costs, in reality, probably slightly over $200. Now, before we get into the video of talking about all of the components that go into this $200-ish gaming PC, I do want to mention that I did make a video about the entire eBay process that I use quite frequently to buy some of these, especially these pre-builts, and then put together systems so I can sell them and make a little bit of money on them. And if you're interested in that, I'll go ahead and link a card up for that. And if you watch that video, one of the first things you're going to notice about this system is I did not use the GPU from that eBay video in this particular build, and the only reason for that is the GPU was too large for this case. I wasn't really keeping in mind that these Dell Optiplex systems, while having a little bit of room for GPUs, they don't have an infinite amount of room, and the GPU that I purchased, the MSI one, the RX 580 MSI 4GB version, was just too long for this case without interfering with this drive cage. Now sure, I could have absolutely cut out that drive cage and found a different way to mount my drives, but frankly that's just obnoxious to do. It takes away from the clean look of the interior of these Optiplexes. Anytime you start to mod a case, you actually start to play a little bit with the value. People, I don't think, really want to buy a case, especially a pre-built like this that's been heavily modded to sort of stuff in all the components that you want to fit in it. So instead, I just pulled out a 480 that I have. This is a 4GB RX 480 card, and that 580 is going to be used in a different build very soon, but this 480 was a little bit cheaper than the 580. This one was about, I think it was like $70 some after tax and after shipping and everything else. This was an eBay deal I picked up a while back, but it does serve this build very nicely, as we'll see here in a little bit with the benchmarks. So to get a little bit into some of the cost that's going on, as well as what components are actually in the build, and I'll go ahead and put the list of components that I sort of cobbled together here to get the build total in here. But starting off with the base system, the Dell Optiplex, this features an i5-3470 from Intel, and the system came with a 4GB stick of RAM, which I exchanged for an 8GB stick of DDR3 RAM that I already had on hand. Now the system did come with this 500GB hard drive, and in addition, because I just like snappy operating systems, I did go ahead and add a 120GB SSD, which is actually brand new, costs about $20 after shipping and tax and all that is handled. And then of course we have the 480 here. Now you'll notice the 480 actually takes an 8-pin PCIe connector for power, which I am using an adapter for the 6-pin that comes off of the power supply. Now this power supply is an OEM power supply for Dell systems. This is a 350 watt unit, though it can only do 300 watts combined on the 12 volt rails, which does come into play here in a little bit. And to keep myself under that 300 watt limit for the 12 volt rail, because the system was actually drawing just barely over 300 watts at complete full gaming load, what I did was went into MSI Afterburner and set a minus 10% on the power for the RX 480, so the power target's a little bit lower, which did save me about 20 watts in gaming, at least in the most demanding title I tested here, Metro Exodus. I went from 301, 302 total system watts down to about 280 at maximum, which is staying below the 300 watts for the 12 volt rails. I have no way of knowing exactly what my 12 volt rail combined load is, so I did want to stay well beneath that, and 20 watts at complete and utter total load, which is not always going to be the case, should be plenty for this system. Now for testing of this system, I did use the same 3 titles I've used in recent videos. These are all 2019 titles, starting with Anno 1800, then we have Resident Evil 2 the remake, and then finishing off with Metro Exodus, which seems to do a really good job of loading up the CPU and GPU, at least on this system, pretty much equally, in so much as these two things are pretty much pinned at 100%, the CPU and GPU. So from a gaming perspective load, I can't see things being any more demanding on the system than Metro Exodus, at least for the most part, and including synthetics like AIDA64 was not quite as demanding as Metro Exodus, at least from a power use standpoint. So that was the highest power use that I saw at 280 watts with the negative 10% power offset on the RX 480. And since many of you asked for things like CPU usage and GPU usage, I did include those on the screen capture today of the gameplay, so you can kind of get a feel for how much each component is being used in the testing. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into that testing and take a look at what we found out. Now, Anno 1800 ran just okay on this system, and by and large it was an extremely playable experience, but it's also very difficult to benchmark this game consistently on systems, and that's mostly because you're constantly zooming in, zooming out, jumping from different islands with different densities of cities and populations, that sort of thing. So benchmarking this game is particularly difficult. Now, all that being said, I did see an average frame rate of 52 with a 1% low of 30 and a 0.1% low of 25 in this title, because again, it's a very slow experience with RTS games like Anno 1800. I would definitely classify this as perfectly playable at these settings, and because it was at medium settings, if you really do want to hit that 60 FPS average, you can always drop some settings down a little bit further. Now, the Resident Evil 2 remake saw an average FPS in my benchmarking run here of 76 with 1% low of 47 and 0.1% low of 32, which is perfectly acceptable again for this game, especially since we were keeping that 0.1% and 1% low numbers. Those were both being kept above 30 FPS, and the average was well north of 60 FPS. Because this is not an overly fast-paced game, that average is perfectly fine, again, especially because I wasn't really seeing any sort of stuttering to speak of. So this game, once again, with this particular system, gets a pass. Now, there is a lot to say about this PC running Metro Exodus. The first thing to point out here is that with Metro Exodus, I like to run this game through benchmarks without tessellation on, and that's because it seems to really hurt the frame rate. So if you're struggling with frame rate in this game, turning off tessellation is a really nice way to get your frames back up. All that being said, though, you'll also notice the GPU and the CPU are both nearly pinned throughout the run here. It does seem like the GPU takes a little bit more of a hit throughout, but it is working both these components extremely hard, and you can kind of tell that that's the case with the average being 84, but the 1% low is down at 48, and 0.1% low is clear down at 23 on this title, and that's a little bit concerning for this PC, because I think this is the main title that actually shows this PC's age, and I think that bottleneck that's introducing a little bit of some micro stutter here and there that gives us that 23.1% low is probably on account of an i5 processor in the 3000 generation. Is just a little bit lower clocks. It has lower IPC than modern processors, but we're also only working with 4 cores and 4 threads. Now, that stutter was not all over the place. It seemed to be mostly when I was walking into a new area, possibly a new room, but it was definitely present and does lead to some concern moving forward with a PC like this, especially when we see more modern AAA titles that are very graphically demanding coming out. Things like Red Dead Redemption 2, for example, you might really need to knock down settings to get frame rates over 60 consistently. So it was a very playable experience, but there is a little bit of concern based on this benchmark run. Now, before I close out this video, I did want to make mention of temperatures. The GPU was getting up right near that 80-degree mark in gaming, and it pretty much stabilized at that point. The CPU was completely under control with no problem whatsoever, and that's really what I would expect from an i5-3470. That is not a hot CPU, so it's no surprise that was under control. And part of that comes from these Dell Optiplexes actually having a fairly nice mesh in front, so there's actually some sort of intake available for these rear fans, and because the power supply is taking in air from inside the chassis and expelling it out the back, and we also have this exhaust fan, we do have a negative pressure setup, but most of that air is going to be coming in through that front mesh and then being pulled through the system and then pushed out the back of the system. It's not fantastic airflow, and certainly adding a front fan would help that out a lot. But in this case, it does work out fairly well, and frankly, with the power supply and with the case, with the platform and everything considered, you're not really going to be able to pack much more performance into one of these Optiplexes. So for the most part, even though it's not great airflow, it's good enough for these systems. But that pretty much wraps up this system at just over $200. You can get your hands on something very similar. I won't say that these deals are always readily available, but you can almost always find deals that are pretty much on par with this deal. I wouldn't say anything in this system was a fantastic value. It's nothing crazy and over the top. The only thing that kind of approaches that is the RX 480. I don't typically see them going quite this cheap right now, but occasionally you do find one for a really good value. Anyways, With all that said, I do want to hear from you guys. What do you think about this system, this Optiplex, these sort of very inexpensive gaming PCs? Is this something that you would be interested in, especially if you were just getting into PC gaming? Or are you more of the mindset of spend 2 or 3 times as much, maybe $500-600, and get yourself a new PC that's also gonna last for a little while longer? Packing something like a Ryzen system in there with maybe something like a GTX 1660, somewhere in that range. I do want to know your thoughts on this system, on buying new, whatever you want to put down there. All that in the comments down below. And of course, if you like this video and you want to see more like it, give this video a like, share, subscribe, comment. All those things are very helpful to the channel. You can follow me both on Instagram and on Twitter at Hoosier Hardware. And as always, I'll let YouTube queue up a couple more videos from my channel for you to watch. I'm Shane with Hoosier Hardware, and I'll see you guys in the next video.